Open your Bibles to Matthew 5. We're going to look at verse 5 this evening. Matthew 5:5. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. I don't know if you wrestled with a brother or a sister when you were growing up. Or maybe there was a childhood friend who lived down the street with whom you would, not fight, but that you guys would kind of wrestle, tussle. And when one was beating the other, you would hear something like this: "Say, uncle." And of course, what they were saying is, you need to give up. I was asking myself recently, what in the world does that even mean? So I looked it up. What does "say uncle" mean? And do you know? Nobody really knows. It could be an Irish expression that sounds like the word uncle, but it's a completely different word. It may be that there were other ideas, none of them plausible. And I was reading that and thinking, that's not very helpful. I was hoping for something, this really cool story I could tell you, but "say uncle" just means, do you give up or not? We had these two little dogs when I was in college. My dad got them. I'm not sure why, because we didn't have a lot of animals in our home growing up. But we had these two little dogs that he bought. First, he got one. It was a little schnauzer, and he named it Eva. And then we got another schnauzer a few months later, and he was black, and he named it Ingrid. And then I found out that this was the name of two girls he knew in college, and that they had dated this particular guy, whose name, if I actually said, you would know. So I'm not gonna mention him. But he found that amusing, I guess, to name these two little dogs after these two young ladies he knew when he was in school. I loved playing with those dogs. They were small. Even when they would bite, it didn't hurt. So you'd get a ball and wrestle with the dogs, and they would wrestle with you. And it was a lot of fun. But Ingrid had been in a bad home and had been somewhat mistreated as a puppy. And schnauzers aren't big dogs anyway. And so in any kind of fight with Ingrid, with Eva, or with anyone, even playing around, Ingrid would immediately give up and roll over on her back and show her belly. That's the give up posture. In animal world, that's "I'm ready to die" posture, because I'm completely giving up. What this verse means, verse 5, is roll over on your back, show your belly, and give up to God. That's what the verse means. Submission to God is an important Christian character trait. It's similar to being poor in spirit from verse 3. The poor in spirit are those who see themselves as entirely dependent on God. They're reduced to begging. This is what it means to be destitute. There's no way the beggar can care for himself. But of course, we studied that verse 3. We understand that to be poor in spirit is not to be materially impoverished, but rather to be spiritually impoverished, so that we know we cannot stand before God. We're entirely spiritually dependent on Him. There is a special kind of humility that comes with this. To say, I am entirely, Lord, dependent upon you. Think about the tax collector in the temple beating his chest and saying, Lord, be merciful to me, a sinner. So the connection between verse 3 and verse 5 is the poor in spirit and the concept of meekness. And both Greek terms have similar ideas in mind. In verse 3, dependence, but in verse 5, submission. You can see how close in thought those two ideas are. So those who are meek are those who are submissive to God. Let's read the verse again. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. This is the best understanding of the concept of meekness in this text. Now, the Greek word means, in isolation, just looking at the word itself, to be mild in one's disposition. A meek person is a gentle person. But that's not how the term should be understood here. As with all language, words have meaning with the words around them. So when I talk about my trunk, you think I'm talking about the back of my car, but I could be talking about my suitcase. And if I talk about taking my trunk on vacation, you might think, well, he's driving his car. Or I could be referring to the trunk of my body. The word trunk actually has about 8 or 9 different meanings. So when we use a word like meekness here, remember, we're looking at all the words and we're seeing the spiritual slant that Jesus is putting on them. Poor in spirit is talking about a person who's dependent on the Lord. Those who mourn, they're not just sorrowful, they're mourning for their sins. So the meekness here is not just a sense of gentility, but actually it's a completely different spiritual quality. Here, meekness, in comparison with poverty of spirit, is interpreted better as dependence upon the Lord. So if you read it, it's this way: blessed are those who are spiritually dependent upon God, because they will inherit the earth. This idea of being fully and totally submissive to the Lord. Now, how do we know that's true? You'd say, wait a minute, but the word means to be gentle or mild. So maybe you're over-interpreting this. I don't think so. Let's leave our finger here and go to Psalm 37 for just a moment. Let's go to Psalm 37, and now let's look at the place in the Old Testament from which Jesus is actually deriving his statement. Psalm 37, look down at verse 11, and let's read that, you silently while I read it aloud. But the meek shall inherit the earth. There's the statement. What Jesus is saying in Matthew 5:5 is a direct quotation from Psalm 37, verse 11a. He's saying that the humble man will inherit the land. This is someone who seeks to live a godly life, even as those who are around him are ungodly seem to be successful. In fact, that's how the psalm begins. Don't be fretting because of evildoers. Don't be envious of the workers of iniquity. Psalm 37 is contrasting the wicked with the godly, and the wicked are seemingly blessed. They are flourishing right now. The psalmist says, like a flowering plant, like a spreading tree. They are wealthy now. You look at these people, and it just seems like the world is in their pocket. They never can do wrong. And even though their lives are not being lived for Christ, even though they don't care about whether they sin against God or not, it just seems like they have it all. But their prosperity is the result of their wickedness. The psalmist makes clear it's because they steal from others. They borrow money without repaying their debts, and they harm people and steal their stuff. And this is not blessed by God. David writes here that they will soon die, that they will be destroyed, that they will one day be gone, that God laughs at them, that they will be burned away and have no future. I want you to stop and think about what the psalmist is saying. Instead of looking at these people who seemingly have it all, who seemingly are doing so well, I don't envy them, I'm not jealous of them. Instead, I'm recognizing that actually their lives are falling apart, that they are on the broad road that leads to destruction, that the last step they take on earth will step them into a godless hell. And I don't envy that at all. I don't want that at all. I don't look at that and say, oh, I wish I could be like them. And then David says, they seemingly have it so well, even though God is not for them. But the righteous are seemingly cursed, but actually blessed. Because God gives himself to the righteous. They delight in him, and he gives them what they delight in. They have a sure inheritance, provisions in times of famine. God is the one who upholds them. Their path is secure. He is their refuge. So the meek should rejoice in their God. Don't envy the wicked. Trust in the Lord. Delight in him. Commit your way to him. Be still. Be patient before him. Turn from anger. Hope in the Lord. Consider yourself to be blessed. God will keep your steps. He holds your hand so that I can lend freely and I can seek peace with others, knowing God is the one who delivers me. You see, this is what Jesus is drawing from. He's taking his words back into this psalm, and he's drawing the meaning of this psalm, and he's dragging that meaning into the New Testament. And he says here, a quotation from verse 11, that the meek will inherit the earth. So the blessed man, Jesus says, is someone who's meek, someone who's submissive to God, because that man is blessed by God. You see, that's why the meek man is submissive. He believes God's promises to him. So he trusts in God, Psalm 37:3 and verse 5. He takes delight in God, verse 4. He waits expectantly on God, verse 7. He hopes in God, verse 9. And he's always living in a way that's submissive to God. He's upright, verse 4. He's righteous. And that word is mentioned in verse 17, 21, 25, 29, 30, and 39. It's clearly a theme of the psalm. He's blameless before God, verse 18 and verse 37, and he walks with his God in verse 37. So the question here is this: are you today submissive to the Lord? If we were talking about just having a gentle spirit, maybe some of you, especially those with a milder personality, could go, hey, that's kind of me. But it doesn't matter your personality here. The question is, you as you are constituted, are you living in submission to God? When we talk about that word submission, we're talking about someone who actually orders his life under the authority of another. Do you say, God, you control me. You're in charge of me. Now, if you are a child or an adolescent, that is, you live at home dependent on your parents, even if you're 21 years old and you're dependent upon your parents, you count as an adolescent. I'm sorry, that's just the definition, right? The question is, do you obey your parents? You children, are you living obedient to your parents? When your parents ask you to do something, when they give you a job, are you listening to them? Are you being obedient to them? When mom and dad says, clean your room, do you go and clean your room? When they give you chores and jobs around the house, do you do those things to the Lord? Are you realizing that's your obedience to Christ, is by obeying your parents? Wives, are you living in submission to your husbands as part of your submission to the Lord? Are you cherishing and desiring to have that meek and quiet spirit that the Bible emphasizes for godly women? Men, are you loving your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself sacrificially for it? And are you following God's leading in your life? Some of you are teenagers. Soon you're going to have to make some really important decisions. You're going to have to decide whether or not you go to college, what you're going to study, and whether or not you're going to get married and who you'll marry, and just the life path, whether or not you're going to go to church. Mom and dad aren't going to be standing over your shoulder saying, hey, do you go to church? And you have to actually make that decision for yourself. And what about it, young adults? Are you living for the Lord? Are you wanting to please him and serve him with your lives? And family life. All of you, you're not really young adults anymore, but you're not old. You're just kind of in the middle, right? Are you living for the Lord? Can you honestly say, outsiders, if they looked at us, they looked at our family, they would say, these are people living for God? And for all of you who've reached the golden years of retirement, are you still living for God, or is it my time? I was waiting for this all my life. I finally got some money together, and the kids are gone. Whew, and now it's my time. Is that how you look at it? Or is it, it's my opportunity now that I'm free of obligations, I can serve God unfettered? Are you meek and submissive to God in doing his will? Now, just as submission to God is an important Christian character trait, we learn from Jesus here that doing it results in a future inheritance that is blessed by him. This is point number 2. You will enjoy the covenant promises of God. Submission results in an inheritance. Look again at the verse. Blessed are the meek. Why? For they shall inherit the earth. I want to say, I believe this is true. It would be a very difficult and long process for me to prove this absolutely. So I'm asking you to give me a little bit of the benefit of the doubt here. I'm not going to prove it. I just don't have the time to walk through every Bible passage to try to prove this. But I believe this is true. Here it is. The more subservient you are to God now, the more inheritance you will receive from him later. The more you serve God now, the more you submit to him now, the more you will receive for him in rewards later. Here's why I say that. First of all, much of what's being said here in this entire passage is being drawn out of Isaiah 61. The suffering servant, that's Jesus, preaches to the needy who, in hearing it, will inherit the land. And the idea behind it is that there's this inheritance for those who submit themselves to God. In fact, that idea is in the kingdom parables. If you look at the parable of the minas in Luke 19, you remember that story? You've got these guys who get this money, and one invests the money in one way, and one invests the money in another way, and one doesn't invest the money at all. And the obedient servant who's faithful to God is rewarded. And the more faithful is rewarded more. In fact, I think that's a good picture of the Bema seat of Christ, what we call the judgment seat of Christ. It's not a negative judgment, it's a positive judgment. And those who serve God receive the Stephanos crown, the laurel wreath victor's crown. And that is a blessing that every single believer can have if they just say, I'm going to invest this life for God. And so one day when we stand before the Lord and he judges us, it's not going to be, let me point out every sin and failure you made. Those are all under the blood, under the cross. But what he is going to do, I think, is he's going to look at you and say, what did you do for me? How did you serve me with your life? Were you faithful with the talents? Were you faithful with the spiritual gifts that I gave you? Did you actually use them to serve me? And those who serve God more, they're rewarded more. Not to press the illustration too far, but what happens to the disobedient servant? He's not saved at all. He's not even one of God's people because he ends up cast out and killed. So he goes a way that isn't good. And then you have a similar parable in Matthew 24, the parable of the talents. But in both of these cases, the same idea is being given. Those who serve God more are those who are rewarded more. And the connection of inheritance is with submission. Look at the verse again. They shall inherit. This inheritance has then this eschatological promise. Let me stop and say this. You can serve God now, you can give him your whole life now, and get very little out of it today. In fact, most people who serve God with their whole lives don't get very much out of it today. You give God your life, you might not get much back, materially speaking. But I'm going to tell you something. There is a major blessing for you if you give God your life now, because they shall inherit the earth. This promise is a future promise of a day that will come someday to inherit the land. Well, frankly, that's a little bit of a Jewish idea. Remember, they were promised the land. The Pentateuch presents this idea. Remember Abraham? He was told to leave Ur, and he would go out to a land that he would after receive for an inheritance. And Hebrews 11 tells us he obeyed, and he went out. He didn't know where he was going, but he went and he walked through the land of promise. That's why when you get to the story of him telling Lot, pick out where you want to go, actually, the land promise was in danger there. Lot could have chosen part of Abraham's inheritance. Instead, he chose Sodom and Gomorrah because it was good for farming. Abraham's land was saved. And then the patriarchs Isaac and Jacob came behind him. Do you know why Joseph was absolutely forceful in making the children of Israel promise him something when he died? Do you remember what it was? Carry my bones to the land. Dig up my body and carry my bones with you. And then comes Moses, and Moses takes the children of Israel. He brings them up out of the land of Egypt under the power of God and the leading of God, and he takes them across the Red Sea, and he takes them to Sinai where they receive the tables of the covenant, and he wanders through the desert till they get to Canaan. And of course, because of the sin of the people, they have to wander 40 more years in the desert. And because of Moses' sin and how he treated the rock that would give them water, Moses is denied entry into the promised land. But all of that's then confirmed with Joshua. They cross over the Jordan River. They take Jericho. They have a little problem with Ai, but they take Ai, and then they conquer the kings of the south and the kings of the north, and they take the promised land, and it becomes theirs. And all throughout the Old Testament, then we have this theme. This land, it's given to you as long as you remain obedient to the Lord. But when you disobey him, and you become idolatrous, and you seek other gods, then God will take this land away from you and give it to someone else, and you'll be punished. But even in those punishments, God is always giving this promise through the prophets, in Isaiah, in Jeremiah. You find it in Ezekiel. You'll come back to the land, and when you come back to the land, God will establish you there. It's all eschatological. So you look at this. The meek shall inherit the earth, and there's a land promise. But it's not that land promise. That land promise isn't given to me. I'm not Jewish. It's not mine. So our land promise is a little bit different. First of all, it's a future promise, not a present promise. And I'll give you two reasons for that. First is grammatically, look at the word shall. It gives the idea that it's in the future. It's a future promise. It's something that will happen. And then the word inheritance gives you the same idea, because inheritance is something that you gain later. You don't typically gain your inheritance in the moment. Anytime you use the word inheritance, you're using an idea of something that you will get at a future time. So when we inherit the land as God's people today, we're not thinking someday we're all going to live in Israel and live in the promised land. That's for Israel. We sing, we're marching to Zion, beautiful, beautiful Zion, but that's just a metaphor. And we sing, bound for Canaan. On Jordan's stormy banks I stand and cast a wishful eye to Canaan's fair and happy land where my possessions lie. I am bound for the kingdom. Who will go to glory with me? Well, those songs are well-meaning, but they're a little off, right? It's not what he's saying. It's not a Jewish land. And it's not heaven. This is not a promise of heaven. Because too many of us have gotten our theology of heaven from hymns, we kind of are messed up a little bit in the way we think of heaven. Heaven is a wonderful, glorious place where those who die in Christ go before he's returned to give them their promised new body. And all of us who die in Christ before Jesus comes back, we die and we don't have bodies. We go in what's called the intermediate state, and we live in heaven. He says, I go and I'm preparing a place for you. But remember, at the end of Revelation, where does that place that Jesus is preparing go? It comes down out of heaven, down to earth, and it's called the New Jerusalem. That's for Jewish people. And for that millennial reign of Christ, Who's going to be ruling in the New Jerusalem? Well, I think David rules there, actually. I think he'll be ruling over the Jews that are there. But I also believe Jesus will be ruling there. David ruling under Jesus. And Jesus will be ruling the whole earth. And I think that's what Jesus is talking about here. In Matthew, earth and heaven are always distinct. Remember, what's the prayer that we pray every Sunday here? It's drawn from Matthew 6. It's from this very sermon. Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. What's the next phrase? On, as it is in two different places. Did you see that? Two different places. So when Jesus says you'll inherit the earth, he's not saying you'll inherit the heaven. That's not what Jesus is saying. He's saying you're going to inherit land, dirt. Dirt and grass and fields and farms. You're going to inherit earth. Earth is literal. Matthew uses it literally. Heaven is literal. He uses it literally. So since this is future, it's an inheritance. It's something that shall happen. And because it's earth, the only good interpretation of this, in my mind, is that it is a future earth. One that is given to us when God remakes heaven and earth at the end. So this has to be, in my thinking, an eschatological land promise. So who do you envy more? I read recently that Michael Jordan, he's worth a gazillion dollars, isn't he? 10 gazillion something. I mean, who can count that high? He'll never spend that money in 10 lifetimes. He has so much money. And there are other people like him. But Michael Jordan recently sold his house in Chicago. You drive up to the front gate, and it's this beautiful gate with, it's metal, and on the front is the number 23 in the middle of the gate. That was his number for the Bulls. And it opens, and you drive inside, a beautiful palatial setting. There's a full gymnasium, NBA court in his house. And you just look at that, and you think, that's really incredible. But he sold it. It's not even his anymore. Somebody else is going to own it. So they could take 23 off and put 37 on, or whatever number they want, right? Or no number at all. Could put the head of a cow or whatever they please. Wouldn't matter. It's not his anymore. It's theirs. Some of you have been to Biltmore. I was glad to see that Biltmore was spared. It made sense because he built it kind of on top of a mountain, right? So I would think that if that hurricane had hurt anything, it probably wouldn't be the house itself, maybe the gardens, the grounds. It was pretty well spared. Where are the Vanderbilts today? Where's Cornelius Vanderbilt, the one who made all the money? He's gone. Where's his son, the one who couldn't quite cut it as a businessman? He's gone. Where's his nephew who built Biltmore? He's gone. His wife's gone. Their child who had 43 bathrooms to choose from, 43, she's gone. They don't even own that house anymore. The Vanderbilt money is gone. There's a guy who works for CNN. He's a reporter. He's the last of that money. And all that money's gone, he said. Not any of it's left. The money he has is the money he's earned as a reporter. You think about that. It's all gone. Do you envy them? Fret not yourself because of evildoers, Psalm 37, because they'll be cut off. But you get to inherit the land. So who's really blessed? So for this life, for me, 20, 25, 30 years, will I live to be 84? Maybe. My dad's 84. Maybe I'll live to be 85. I don't know. I guess it's possible I could live to be 90, but do I anticipate living to be 90? No. I don't think I'll live to be 90. I doubt I'll live to be 85, but if I do, I do. I guess I might even live to be 100 years old. I guess that's possible. They probably, all my body parts would be gone. They'll all be some sort of computer running, everything, but I'm still there, smiling. But then I'm gone, right? Do you envy those people who have all that stuff for those few years? What about you? Blessed are the meek, because they get it for eternity. Now that's the person I envy. So be submissive to God. Be submissive. Lord, whatever you want. Whatever your task is for me, to be in ministry, to not be in ministry, to serve God as a layman in a church, to work a menial job, to work in IT, to make a lot of money, to make little money, to drive a nice car, to drive an old junker, to have carpet and wallpaper, or to have hard cement floors or wood floors or dirt floors, to be like my friend Tia, whose wife cooks on an open hearth and he uses bathroom in an outhouse in India. You can be like that. And that's all you have. And that's fine. Because one day, he's going to inherit the earth. All of it. It's his. And that's what God gives to you, if you'll be submissive to him. That's the windfall of the submissive. Let's pray together. Father, help us to live this verse out. To live it out truly in every aspect of life. I pray. Especially our young adults, especially our teens who are just starting out, to purpose in their heart to live this way.